I'm Dr. Gulkin. Most of you know me by name, if not on site. I'm a clinical psychologist. I've consulted with the Open Door Center for more than a couple of years. I don't want to give away my age. And I'm the guilty party. I'm the one who's responsible for behavioral programs. And I'll tell you right up front, my goal today in doing this presentation, and I've done this before, I used to do this for the Open Door Center about every 3 or 4 years. COVID and a number of other things have gotten in the way. So I've not done this presentation since 2017. So I know there are some people still working here who've been through. Has anybody here heard this presentation? I see one head nod. I've talked to some other staff, and Cindy has. My goal, I have a goal in doing this. I want to help people develop a broader understanding of learning and behavior. Most people think they understand how people learn, and I want to share my view that most people have a limited understanding of human learning, and I want to expand that, okay? I don't plan on taking breaks, so if anybody needs to go out, whether it's for a drink or any other personal issue, including smoking a cigarette, which is your problem, not mine, please just get up and leave. Don't raise your hand, don't ask permission. This is not grade school. So we come and go as we need to. I also want to invite you at any time to stop me to ask questions. It does not do any of us good if I lose you. If I say something you don't understand, if I say something confusing, I would much rather you stop me and ask for clarification than let me go on all by myself. So, okay. As a psychologist, I have come to understand learning a little bit differently than the average person on the street.
Thank you. Sorry.
You're welcome. And there's a sign-in sheet. I'm a psychologist. I spent most of my life for decades sitting in a room, talking with people, trying to help them understand how they have learned to view the world, because how you learn to view it dictates how you feel. That's most of my life. But I was lucky enough to have gotten my master's degree in experimental statistical psychology, which is a whole different world from clinical psychology. And I've learned through that program that people and lower animals, but living organisms learn without thinking. You don't have to understand, you don't have to think, you don't have to remember, but you can learn. And it's understanding that process that is the reason we do behavioral programs. That's what I'm all about. And when I'm here as a behavioral psychologist, I don't acknowledge that people think. Not you, not me, not nobody, because that's not what we're talking about. There's a whole different universe of learning other than, what year did Columbus discover America? 1492. Now, how did I know that? I went to school and I was told that. I learned that. That's a different kind of learning than what I'm here to talk about. I'm here to talk about the way humans and other organisms learn without ever once thinking. In fact, in reviewing my notes and going through this, as a graduate student in master's program learning about learning, there's a study that shows that, well, first of all, is there anybody here who believes that cockroaches, those little scurrying bugs, anybody here think that cockroaches think? They have brains, you know. I lived down south and I encountered many, many cockroaches, none of whom seemed to think. Well, there's research that shows you can teach cockroaches things.
Sorry.
Not only can you teach cockroaches things, you can teach a decorticate cockroach, that is a cockroach with their head cut off, you can teach them things. Cockroaches have very small brains, and their brains don't do very much. If you cut off their head, they'll live 10 days to 2 weeks. And the only reason they die is they can't eat. You know, they lose their mouth, but they still do cockroach things. And there's studies that show you can teach a decorticate cockroach. Now, they don't do very good learning Spanish or mathematics, but we can teach cockroaches to go left or right. That's learning. Is it sophisticated? Not at all, but we can demonstrate learning in a decorticate cockroach, and if there's anything that doesn't do any thinking, it's a decorticate cockroach. So now, humans don't work that way. If you cut my head off, I'll stop talking, and you may be thinking, oh, that wouldn't be so terrible. I can't learn without my head, but that's only because I can't live, I can't survive. But there's human learning that does not involve thinking, and my goal is to help you understand that. Why? Not just because it's really interesting, which I found it to be, but because it relates to your jobs. My position is, if you don't understand the basis for what you're doing, you can't do it well. You do it offhand, you do it the best you can, and behavioral programs are set up very specifically. My programs aren't set up because I think they're nice, or I like how it sounds, or it seems like a good way to do it. They're all developed with very, very specific reasons, very specific principles. And if you do it just offhand because, oh, the paper says do this, you're not going to do a good job in running the programs. My reason for doing this presentation is to help people better understand what it is they're doing. What is the reason for doing this? Because then you can do it well. Okay, excuse me. Let me see where I want to start talking. Okay. Let me start with reasons that we do behavioral programs. Those things that are in the charts that I've written are not just a series of words, they're procedures. And the reason that we're doing it is not theory. See, that's, people are going to say, well, I've read Freud's theory. I was trained as a Freudian, wasted several years of my life learning that silliness. Wonderful theory, it's elegant, it's interesting, has no basis. And there are a lot of other theories of human behavior that are equally interesting, but that's all they're theories. They have no basis. We do behavioral programming because there's research that shows it is effective. That's why we do it. It's not that we think it's good, it's not that we think it's a better way to do it or that it sounds good. We do it because there is research that shows it is effective. That's why we do it. That's why our medical doctor gives us one medicine versus another, because research has shown it is effective. So what I present as a strategy for dealing with people is based on the fact that it has been demonstrated to be effective. It's data-based. Again, it's not that I like it. There's a reason for doing it. And that pushes us to use behavioral programs. Now, I've already told you I've done a lot of, quote, talk therapy, counseling, and that's wonderful. We do that at times with some people, but there are a lot of times we can't. Hard as I've tried, I was unable to talk a decorticate cockroach into changing its behavior. Sometimes we're in situations where we can't talk a person into doing things differently, and then we're left doing it behaviorally. So we're gonna use that as a basis. And I'm going to make a comment, and I said this already. There's a paradox. People think that other people change their behavior because they think, and that's true only sometimes. We cannot make that assumption all the time. And for me, as a behavioral psychologist, I'm going to, and I've been here in this agency, and people will say, well, John Doe thinks boom, 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 and I'm going to say, what are you talking about? Well, I know John, and this is what he thinks, and I'm going to say, John doesn't think, but then again, neither do you, and neither do I. That's not what we're doing. We're talking about a behavioral strategy for change. Excuse me. Okay. One of the things that I do, and this is a reframing again of what you're doing, I try to teach people running behavior programs to stop asking certain questions. And one of the main things is I say, we don't ask why questions. This is part of my philosophy as a psychologist, even as a cognitive counselor. Why is an unanswerable question? Any question that starts with why can never be answered. Can never be answered. Why is the sky blue? I can tell you the physics of it, but that doesn't answer why. All why questions go to one place. It's the mind of God. God wants the sky to be blue. Why is fire hot? God made it that way. I ask people to start asking what questions and how. What is happening and how do we change it? Those are the only things that we can reasonably work on. So, okay, that's pretty much the philosophy of where I'm coming from. Now, because I'm trying to expand your thinking, I'm going to talk about some things that will not make a big difference in your lives day to day or even over time, but it's a part of a perspective that I like to share with people because it rounds out your understanding of what we're doing. So let me see, on your outline, okay, factors directing behavior. Well, there are a number of things that have nothing to do with what you're doing. But this is part of the world at large. There are biological factors that drive human behavior. I don't control them, I don't measure them, but as a psychologist and as a behaviorist, I understand that. There are certain things we're born with. Is there anyone here who has not had high school biology? Okay, you've all been there. That means you all readily remember the autonomic nervous system. Of course, I won't ask you any questions on it, but we have a nervous system where we react to the world around us. Fight or flight, does that ring a bell for people? That's biological, that's wired in. You don't learn that. But that is a part of every human we're dealing with. For me, as a behavioral psychologist, yeah, it's there, but I can't do anything about that. Biology, reflexes. Put a finger to someone's eye, they blink. That's not learned, that's wired in. And that's part of our biology. We all have a knee reflex. You go to a doctor, and at least in the past, they used to. They don't do this much anymore, but they'd pop your knee and your leg would jump out. That's the patellar reflex. They're looking to make sure you're not having a medical problem, checking your reflexes. Diseases affect human behavior. Alcohol and drugs affect human behavior. Injury affects human behavior. These are all known factors, not ones that we directly work with, but certainly things that are going to impact people. Now, on your list, under biological factors, it says historical factors. This is the focus. This is our learning history and habit. Habit is a development of our personal learning history, and habit's enormously important. Most people don't think about it this way, but if it wasn't for habit, every morning when you would get up, you would have to relearn how to tie your shoes. Habit allows us to carry forward the knowledge that we've developed so that we can more efficiently live our lives. Human behavior, cognitive. Oh, I just said people don't think. Well, as a behaviorist, I don't deal with this, but I know people think. Each and every one of you is sitting there thinking about what I'm saying. Hopefully it's computing, hopefully it's making sense, but you are all thinking, and over time, the cognitive stuff contributes. Like, how did I remember that Columbus discovered America? I don't know. But that's part of my history of learning, and it's our ability to maintain information that allows us to learn things and do things differently, but it's not exclusive. That's the point. I recognize that thinking affects behavior, but it's not the totality of learning, and that's the purpose of my talk today. There are so many other factors, individual differences that we're born with. Taste. My preferences, nobody understands. I cannot abide by mushrooms. I like the flavor, but the texture of mushrooms make me crazy. I cannot eat them. Why is that? I don't know. I just accept the fact that I don't enjoy them. Asparagus. Anybody here like asparagus? You can have mine. I have a friend who's so proud of their asparagus garden and insisted that I had to try it. And I said, I don't like asparagus. And she nagged me and nagged me and nagged. Her husband was grinning because he knew it was coming. And she finally talked me into trying her wonderful asparagus. And I took a bite and I put it in my mouth, and she said, what do you think? And I said, it tastes like asparagus. And she says, yeah, but what do you think? I said, I don't like asparagus. And she was crushed. It's taste. She didn't do anything wrong or bad. I don't like asparagus. It's just the way it is. That affects me. And that affects me in ways that relate to behavioral programming, because later on, I'm going to be talking with you about the variables we know which impact human behavior. And, if you want me to do something, reward me. But if you want me to do something and you reward me with asparagus, it ain't going to happen. There's going to be no learning. That's one of the points of behavioral programming that is always coming up when I'm talking with staff, because if you don't know what is a reward for someone, you can't do programming, and that's often a challenge. I usually have a board I can write on. I don't have one here, but what I did to summarize all this, I have a little circle Biology, a person's biology and their history interact. Learning interacts with all of that. Cognitions, thinking interact, it all interacts, and that whole big messy circle is what leads to learning and behavior. When I do a behavioral program, I don't control history, I don't control biology, I control one little bitty piece of that individual's reality. And I'm attempting to help find a way to produce very specific kinds of changes. Excuse me. And I skipped a comment earlier on, and that is with you as staff who are assigned the task of carrying out a behavioral program, people get wrapped up in their jobs, and that's good. People care and they want to get positive outcomes. But people sometimes lose track of the fact that as staff, your job is to carry out the programs that are written. Your job is not to change people. And one of the points that I'm always making is we can't change people. We try to change their environment in ways that are known to influence behavior. Some behaviors we want to increase in frequency, others we want to decrease in frequency. And as staff, we do not control people. That's why as staff, you're not responsible for anything beyond implementing the program. Philosophically, we don't control people. Control is beyond what we do. As a counselor, as a behavioral programmer, as staff, we don't control. Control. I have no control over that phone either. Okay. Remember the difference between learning and control. If you handcuff someone to a wall, you control their behavior, but they're not learning anything. When a one-year-old child goes dashing in the street and you grab them to save their life, that's control, it's life and death, but it's not true learning. When police wrestle someone to the ground, that's a crisis intervention, that's not a learning model. And we want to be very clear that behavioral program is not control. The only thing we quote control are elements of the environment. That's our jobs. We make sure we reinforce certain behaviors, and sometimes we have to punish alternative behaviors. Our job is to control the individual's experiences, because what's coming in my talk is the basis for knowing how those environmental effects, the rewards and the punishers, produce change in a person's behavior, but it's not control. Learning is not a control process. Okay. Now, the reason that we're doing this is these materials that are outlined on the sheet before you turn out to be the best applied understanding of human behavior and behavior change that there is. People can say they don't like it, but it doesn't change the fact that the best demonstration of change comes from this, and it's based upon tons of research. tons and hundreds of thousands of studies which confirm something that each and every one of you know. When you think about your experiences in life, the best example that we as individuals have, is there anyone here who has not been involved in the raising of a child? Okay. Do children learn like that? You tell them, don't leave the door open, and they stop doing it just because you said don't leave it open? No, that's not how we learn. Learning is gradual, it's in increments, little bitty steps, and it's inconsistent. They go back and forth and back and forth. And my example of closing the door, my then 2 adolescent sons couldn't remember, I'm putting that in quotes, they couldn't remember to lock the front door. Now we're in Jamestown, not like we lived in a slum, but I like to go to bed knowing my front door is locked. They couldn't seem to remember. And at one point I said, this is silly, I'm not going to go through this anymore. So I spent the money, I bought the kind of door lock that you have in motels. The door, when you close it, it's locked on the outside and you can only get in with a key. And I changed the lock and I gave each one of them a key. I gave my wife a key too. I thought I'd be generous. And they said to me, why are you doing this? I said, I sleep better knowing the door is locked and I've lost faith in your doing it. But you have a key, so you can let yourself in with the key whenever you're out there. They're grown adults now. I have no idea whether they're locking the door, but I slept better for a while. So we're gonna do things that gradually change behavior. And I will tell you, that is one of the downsides of behavioral programming. It's frustrating because it's not immediate. Staff often say to me, oh, John Doe is doing this or that. Will you write a program? But they're disappointed because I put words on a piece of paper and John Doe's behavior doesn't change. Imagine that. People's behavior doesn't change because I write words on a piece. If it did, I'd be rich and famous and you wouldn't be hearing me. People's behavior change when their life experiences change. And it is a gradual, inconsistent process. The nice thing is that it does work. We don't have to assume memory. We don't have to assume understanding. We do have to assume responsibility of developing a program consistent with the principles that we know and a consistent applying of them, because down on your outline, I'm going to talk about it, and one of the things that we've learned with a lot of study is that consistency is very, very important. Inconsistency creates some other problems. Nobody said anything, or I've had times when people would say, well, aren't there times when there's very, very sudden, abrupt learning? And the answer is there is. In certain extremes, trauma learning. Sometimes people are subjected to extremely painful, frightening things, and they learn, boom. That kind of learning is often not good. The flip side, I can't vouch for it, but I've been told that crack cocaine is so rewarding, is so pleasurable that you do it once and you're addicted. Is it true? I don't know. I've had a lot of addicted people tell me that, and I'm not going to try to find out, because if it is, then I'm stuck with an addiction that I don't want to deal with. There are extremes, but the normal range of human behavior changes slowly, incrementally, variably. It goes up and down. That's part of the frustration of normal learning. Anybody here learn to ride a bike or a roller skate with only falling once? No. I have bad eyes, so balance is not my forte. And I fell probably more times than any 5 or 6 of you. I'm a slow learner, but I was driven and I put up with it, and I still have scabs and scars from that. I learned. But it's not once and done. Very, very little human learning is once and done, and if you expect it, you're going to be very frustrated. In fact, I said that a friend of mine is a psychiatrist, and he has a sort of dark sense of humor that goes along with mine, and we were talking once about a criminal population, and he said to me, you psychologists haven't done a real good job in changing these human behaviors. And I said, yeah, you're right. And he said, well, medically, I can change that behavior in one trial. I said, oh, how's that? He said, with an injection. I said, tell me about this. I want to know. And he said, well, I can change those criminal behaviors with one lead injection. And I said, a lead injection? And he said, yeah, about a half an ounce of lead in a 45 in the back of the head will change their behavior and they're not going to offend again. You know, you got to have a dark sense of humor for that. But see, that is not a psychiatric or a psychological intervention. That's a social one. That, you know, basically he's saying he believes in the death penalty for certain crimes. As a psychologist, I don't have an opinion. That's a social, moral, legal thing, and everyone in this room will have their own opinion, but we're not here to talk about opinions about this, that, or the other. We're here to talk about what is known about human learning and how we change that. So, okay. As a behaviorist, a name that's on your sheet is near and dear to my heart is Clark Hull. Clark Hull is a psychologist who is really the central point of behavioral programming. He published a book in 1943, The Principles of Behavior. I spent a whole year, 2-semester class, doing nothing but studying that one little paperback because my professor required a full and total understanding of that, to the point that everyone in the class was able to reproduce the whole book cover to cover. It is central to understanding, and that's what I'm going to review with you very quickly. I say very quickly because in training a group of 30 to 40 new staff at another hospital in another state, going to run a behavioral program. This is cutting edge back in the early 70s when I was doing this. Oh, I just gave you a hint. Now you know I'm more than 35 years old. But taught this group behavioral programming 40 hours a week for 4 consecutive weeks. We spent 160 hours studying what we're covering today in a couple hours. So that tells you there's a whole lot more. But Clark Hull summarized a lot of research and came up with the basics of what we now know as the behavioral principles of learning. Covers everything from decorticate cockroaches up to all of us in the room. And I have a little secret measure that I use, and when I'm talking with people who profess to be knowledgeable behaviorists, behavioral programming people, and I'm not sure I believe them, I kind of work my way around and manage to squeeze in a question about the law of effect. If you can't tell me what the law of effect is, you don't have the basic understanding of behavioral principles. And I'm not going to embarrass people here and say, tell me the law of effect. On the surface, It's simple and obvious, but you have to understand the subtleties and the details. The law of effect. Clark Hall's central idea is that any behavior that is followed by a reinforcing circumstance is more likely to reoccur, and any behavior that is followed by a punishing set of circumstances is less likely to reoccur. The devil is in the details. To fully understand that, I won't ask you the detail, but you got to understand what a reinforcing set of circumstances is. A lot of people don't fully appreciate that because I've already shared with you, if I do something you like and you give me asparagus or mushrooms, you've punished me. So it's less likely to occur. As a behavioral programmer with this agency, when we do programs, I often ask staff a phenomenally difficult question. What is this person like? What's reinforcing for them? If you can't tell me what's reinforcing, I can't program, because then I can't reward the target behavior. Likewise, punishment. We're very limited. Socially, morally, ethically, we don't do a lot of punishment program. I can tell you back when I started here in the mid-'80s, we had more, quote, punishment programs, limited, certainly limited compared to the ones that I was doing back in the early 70s. But if we don't know how to effectively administer, quote, punishment, we can't reduce the frequency of a behavior. So what is a reward? What is a punishment? Limited by a lot of variables. I could do a lot of effective programming here. Tracy, could you provide me with about $50,000 in quarters? Sure, okay. So I'm going to be redoing some program, because if I could start handing out quarters, that's an effective reinforcer. How do you think Tracy got me here?
A whole lot of quarters.
A whole lot of quarters. We got to do that. The other really important part of the law of effect, which gets lost on people, is the statement, a behavior that is followed by a reinforcing state of events is more likely to reoccur. More likely. That goes to the fact that human learning is gradual and incremental. My programs don't change people. It is the experience of having a certain behavior rewarded or punished that leads to a change in frequency. But you got to understand there's so many variables that it's not a one-to-one relationship, and that's why it's gradual. There's so many variables that intervene that you have to understand human behavior changes gradually, and your job is to maintain the written program. You're not responsible for any given person's choice of behavior. The program, this is one of my last statements in my notes, but I'll say it now. What changes an individual's behavior is the experience that they have of engaging in the behavior and the outcome, the reward or the punishment. And one of the things I will tell you is how you feel about a person's behavior is not what changes them. Your approval, your disapproval, your anger, your frustration isn't what changes them. It is the outcome, the reward or the punishment. In fact, as parents, hopefully you've learned that when you get upset, you jump up and down because your child has done something they're not supposed to. That's not effective punishment. In fact, quite the opposite. A lot of kids, bad behaviors maintain because mom and dad throw such a temper tantrum that they're fun to watch. It gives the kid a sense of control over their parents. Yeah, you got stuck in your room for an hour, you were grounded Saturday night, but boy, that was fun watching mom and dad have a hairy fit. Behaviorally, we know the most powerful reinforcers other than quarters and M&Ms. Those are the two things that control my behaviors. Attention. So when you ignore your child until they're bad and you spend a half an hour giving them a lecture when they violate a rule, you've given them attention, you've just rewarded the behavior. It don't work in changing them. We need to know that as staff because the most effective behavioral programming is done more neutrally, especially with loss of reinforcement. The best staff that I see heap attention, reward, smiles, praise, pat on the back continually because that's what changes behavior. In fact, we usually say the most powerful reinforcer that we can administer is attention. The law of effect on the surface is very simple and straightforward and easy to understand, but implementation requires your understanding of the subtleties that are taking place here. What's a reward to a given person? And to complicate this, those of you who may have been with me when we're developing programs is telling me what a reinforcer is for the program, for the person is not bad, but you know what? No one reinforcer is always effective with the person. I've already shared with you that I'm an M&M guy, but you know what? After I eat a big Thanksgiving dinner and I forced down a second piece of pie, you're not going to reinforce me with M&Ms. Their reinforcing value, their reward value is gone. Why? I'm not hungry. So when we set up programs based on the law of effect, I come up with this thing. Some of you may have heard me talk about it. Some of you may have seen it in print, where I talk about a reinforcement menu. Anybody here seen that or heard that? I have a couple of head nods. Not rocket science. You all know there are times when you try to reward someone for a desired behavior and they don't want it. Ah, bummer. What do? Well, you want to reward them. If you have a reinforcement menu, you solve the problem, because what I say is have a reinforcement menu, set up a contingency, the basis for the person earning, and then let them pick the reinforcer, because that way, if they're picking it, it is a reward. You know, we pick our own rewards when we have the chance, which means it's more likely that it's going to be effective in pushing along that learning. Law of effect, cut and dried, but very complex. Okay, that is the law of effect. Behavioral programming is based upon what's called drive theory. What is drive theory? Well, I've already kind of told you indirectly. We pursue things based upon our internal state. When I am hungry, the power of a reinforcer is much greater. When I'm tired, rest is more reinforcing. And human behavior is driven by rewards and punishment. cognitive thinking stuff, no. But the kind of learning I'm talking about is driven by needs. I ran hundreds and hundreds of rat studies. Put rats in, I've never run a cockroach study, I will tell you that. But I have run hundreds of rat studies. Rats are wonderful critters. They're warm and fuzzy, and they're friendly. They make great pets. But we set up the programs based upon drive. In other words, I don't just put any rat in a maze to learn. I put a hungry rat in a maze because it's going to want to earn the pellets. That's the reward it gets. Now, on your sheet, I think I have it. Boom, boom, boom. Okay. There are two things for all organisms that are rewards and two things that are punishment. And you got to know this to set up a program. And this little bit of trivia is also part of the way that I establish in my own head when I'm talking to a supposed expert about behavior programs. And I've been doing this long enough. I'm sorry to say that a lot of people who pose as experts aren't, and a lot of people who come and do program reviews as experts aren't. I'm able to determine their understanding of this by getting around to asking them some little tricky questions. Has anybody here talked about, or been to my talk, or here, what's a reward, what's a punishment, the two kinds of rewards, the two kinds of punishments? Okay, well, because nobody put up their hand, I don't have a person to pick on, so I can't do that. But there are two things, and this is what I look at when I set up a program. There are two basic kinds of rewards. One is a pure positive. What is that? M&Ms, M&Ms. It tastes good, I like it, okay? But where I trap people is negative reinforcement. Has anybody ever heard the term negative reinforcement? I see a couple of head nods, okay? Some people who think they understand behavior programming use negative reinforcement to mean punishment. Well, it's negative, right? So it must be punishing. Wrong. Absolutely, totally wrong. Maybe that's how you use the term. Maybe that's what you think. But in fact, that's not the case. Thank you. Negative reinforcement is the reward. Reinforcement is positive. Negative reinforcement is the reward that comes with the cessation, the stopping of a punishment. When you're let out of timeout, it feels good. That's a reward. If some big guy is sitting on my back and twisting my arm behind my back, that's pretty punishing. And when they let go, it's the relief, the cessation of the pain that feels good. Negative reinforcement is the reward that comes with ending a punishment. There's an old joke about a cop who stops a guy for rolling through a stop sign. He pulls him over, and the guy says, "Well, officer, I slowed down." And the officer said, "But the sign said stop." And he said, "Well, I slowed down." And the officer said, "If I take out my pistol and I start beating you with it, do you want me to simply slow down and beat you more slowly, or do you want me to stop?" That's a little law enforcement joke. You know, the cops I worked with find humor in that. You stop a punishment and it feels, it's like, who here has never had a headache? Everybody's had a headache. What's the experience when the headache's gone? Isn't that wonderful? I have allergies, and when I have an allergy headache, when the headache breaks, it is wonderful. I feel so rewarded. So you stop a punishment, the effect, and it's not my opinion, it's research. We've done research that has shown that when you stop a punishment, it's the same as a reward. And that has an implication for behavioral programming, which was lost on us psychologists at the get-go. And I, for my honesty's sake, I have to admit this. It's embarrassing, but back at the get-go, when I was running those programs in the early 70s, we who developed this didn't understand our own stuff real well because we would use timeout. Well, if punishing a behavior causes it to stop, what happens if you punish a good behavior or a desired behavior? Well, you make it less likely. And that's what we used to do with our punishment. We used to put people in timeout for an hour. Did that for years and years and years until we finally realized, put someone in timeout because they're bouncing off the walls, they settle down after a few minutes, and then they're being good. And what are we doing? We're leaving them in a punishment situation when they're good. That's not smart. That's not consistent with behavioral principles. If punishment reduces the likelihood of a behavior, when you put an agitated person in neutral, what we call neutral area now, as soon as they settle down. If any of you have seen, I just have, I don't know, 2, maybe 3 neutral area programs that are still being used. It says place in a neutral area until, how do I phrase that? Anybody remember? Till quiet and settled, but you know, because as soon as they settle down, you take them out. Because agitation is the target behavior, put them in neutral area, they're quiet. That's what you want. Why punish the behavior you want? So you take them out. If it only takes 2 minutes, that's wonderful. And the standard emotional reaction is, well, that's not much punishment. Well, I don't, morally, I don't know how to measure punishment. If they settle down, that's what you want, and you let them out, because you don't want to leave them in a punishment situation where they're being good. And the most common thing is, well, it's only 2 minutes. What if they start up again? I say, the program's in their chart. You put them back in. That's what it's there for. No big deal. You do it as many times as it takes. That's the idea. You want the behavior to be followed by a punishing state of affairs. Well, what if we have to do it 5 times? I say, isn't that what you're getting paid for? Sorry to be a New Jersey smart aleck, but that's our job, to carry out the program. And the follow-up question is, well, what if you put them in and they settle down in 2 minutes, you take them out and they're fine? What then? Then you just go on with life. But you don't punish them for a full hour. And I'm feeling a sense of discomfort here because I remember that's what we used to do. I say we because that's how we psychologists implemented our programs. And it's really sorry because it's our principles and we misapplied them. But we eventually got caught up. So that's how we terminate a punisher. Now, 2 kinds of rewards, pure positive and negative reinforcement, and there are 2 kinds of punishers. excuse me, the first kind of punishment we just don't do. We don't physically harm people. That's not ethical, it's not legal, it's not moral. That's one kind of punishment. And I want to be very clear here. I'm talking with you about behavioral principles. I'm not talking to you as somebody involved with the criminal justice system. You know, we put people in prison for 20 years. Well, what kind of behavioral program is that? You know, they stop their criminal behavior and they're good, so why don't we just let them out? Well, penitentiaries are not behavioral programs. The reality is that's a social punishment, and that's a social decision. It's not the decision of a behavior modifier.
Can you go over the difference between reinforcer and reward?
Those are interchangeable. Reinforcement is, quote, positive, and there are two kinds of reinforcement. Pure positive is the M&M. Maybe for you it's broccoli, but you know, that's a pure positive reinforcement. And a negative reinforcement is the reward that comes from ending a punishment. One is what you administer because it's positive. The other is the reward that comes from ending a punishment.
So you would use those two words interchangeably, reinforcer and reward?
Yes, I will. Maybe someone else will have some technical, but a pure positive reinforcer is reward. A negative reinforcement is also a reward because you're letting my hand out from behind my back. One is a reward because it tastes good or feels good. The other is a reward because it ends pain. You know, it's really, the wording makes it seem more complicated than it is. And we have the two parallels. There is punishment, which is a life reality, but we don't use it. We don't use it. The other kind of punisher, it's like a mirror. If I deprive you of a reward, you're being punished. Think about it. When I get pulled over, I say when, but it's not been for a while, but when I get pulled over for speeding, I used to do that regularly, and I had an epiphany. I said, oh, I have a cruise control. I've not gotten ticketed since I realized I had a cruise control. But what I've noticed, troopers as a group, when they pull you over, they kill you with kindness. I found them to be polite and courteous. They call me sir. Nobody calls me sir, except the troopers. May I see your license? They don't have to say, may I? They have the legal authority, and they can say, give me your license now. And if I was smart, I would comply. But they don't do that. Why? Because just like behavior programmers, their reactions to my behavior, in this case speeding, is not what controls my behavior. They administer a kind of punishment, not direct punishment, but it's timeout. They give me a modified timeout procedure. They hand me this piece of paper. It's called a ticket, and it cost me $20. I just lost a reinforcer. I have better things to do with that $20 than to send it into Bismarck. It is punishing to be ticketed. It's a loss of reinforcement. And that is a model of behavioral programming. We don't beat people with a club. We don't give them electroshocks. That's how I changed those decorticate. I could teach a decorticate cockroach to turn left or to turn right by giving it little bitty electroshocks. A cockroach without a head still feels pain. We know that by their behavior. I see a couple of head shaking, and yeah, it's a nasty, disgusting thing to think about. I don't like cockroaches, but the idea of chopping their heads off and doing this to them is really weird. But I never did that kind of research. Interesting, but little bitty electroshocks on their legs, they stopped going in that direction. Isn't that weird? That is the biology of learning. That's drive theory. They want to avoid pain. How do I know they, quote, felt pain? Because statistically, I can show that they started turning in a different direction. Wow. That's something to think about. But we're all like that. So the closest we come to punishing is we withhold reinforcement. And I was reviewing my notes and I had a flash from the past. It's a wonderful learning tool, at least it was for me. When I was running that token economy in Tennessee, I had this great little building and I had my well-trained staff and we had our 30 or so individuals. Everything was controlled. Everything was rewarded and punished with tokens. We literally used tokens. The cheapest thing we found was Mexican pesos. The peso was worth so little that we got hundreds of thousands of them for like $100. And we'd paint them different colors and give them different values, just like we have $1 and $5 and $10 and $20 bills. We had 1s, 5, 10s, or tokens. And our clients could earn tokens and they would buy things with tokens. They would get fined if they broke rules. This was cutting edge in the early 70s. This was outer space stuff for most people. It was spooky. And a nice gentleman ran the building next to me with his 25 or 30 clients. Nice man, very conservative, very religious. And he thought what we were doing was immoral. We simply set up a very structured living setting. And he took offense because you had to pay for your meals. But you're earning tokens all the time. You know, most of the people had pockets full of these tokens, and you know, it's 5 tokens or 10 tokens for your meal, and they get in the habit. They give you tokens there. Well, if you don't have your tokens, what do? Well, we stick them in a room for 24 hours and starve them. That'll teach them, right? No. What we did is we made them stand at the end of the line. Everybody else is getting their meals, and they all go into the dining room, and not only are you eating, which is reinforcing, but you're talking and you're interacting, a lot of attention, and it's a reinforcing state of affairs. The people who couldn't pay for their meal would be at the very end, and they would go to another area, and we set it up. It wasn't very often. I mean, it was a very rare event, but they'd be alone. They lost all the reinforcement of that special time. You know, most cultures recognize the value of this. You know, breaking bread is a concept. You share meals. This is part of socializing. We meet with friends and family for shared meals. This is a very human reinforcing thing. And so the gentleman running the program next to me went to the administration and filed a complaint about those people running that terrible program next to us. And he said, they're withholding food, which isn't true. They ate a couple minutes later, and trying to make it sound scientific, he said a couple of things which are ridiculous. He said, they're losing weight because their meals are cold and they have fewer calories. Well, any of you who know the biology of this, even if the food was colder, which it wasn't because they were getting it just a couple minutes later, the calories in your meal come from what's inside the food, not the food's temperature. If temperature made a difference, then people on a diet would eat really cold ice cream and they wouldn't be getting calories, right? No, it doesn't work that way. It has absolutely nothing to do with it. How you generate the calories that a particular food has nothing to do with the temperature. I won't even go into that process. So I was notified that I was being called into the principal's office because a complaint was filed about the program. Now, I was one of several people running it. I just happened to be the lucky one who was on duty the day and time that this was taking place. Knowing that, I ran over to the health office, and I knew the nurse, and I said, can I peek in the files? I want to get some data. And I reviewed the registered weights of all the residents in my program and the other program 6 months ago and now. And being a psychologist, and this isn't behavioral, but I'm trained to do statistics. I did statistics. I got the average weight of his residents 6 months ago, and the average weight of my residents 6 months ago, and the average weight of his now, and the average weight of mine now, and I ran some statistical analysis. And so he makes his case in front of the administration of the hospital about this, and I was asked, I said, what do you have to say about this? I said, well, I cheated because I got some data. And I had a board, and I put Group A, Group B, weight 6 months ago for each, weight 6 months or now. And I said, Group A is a ½ pound lighter on the average now than 6 months ago. And Group B is about 3/4 pound heavier. And if you do the statistics, there's no difference between the groups then and now. There's no difference between internally. So we can't blame diet and means of giving it. And I said, oh, by the way, Group A that lost a ½ pound happened to be his cottage. My cottage gained weight. The room got very quiet. And he and I were adjourned, and it was a very quiet walk down the hallway. And I said to him, sorry. Behavioral programming does not involve, quote, torture. It does involve controlling the environment, and that's what we're paid to do, and we try to do it in ways that make a difference. Any questions? I've gone through material that I think would have probably taken 2 or 3 hours in my formal training program. Okay. I got to tell you, whenever there's no questions, it means either it's crystal clear and you understood everything, or I've so thoroughly confused you that you don't know where to begin. But I'm going to assume I was crystal clear because I don't know what else to do. Okay. Got some detail, and this is my responsibility in setting up the program, but I want you to at least get a little bit of exposure to this, because again, this all goes to what we know about this learning thing, okay? a reinforcement contingency, that is the hooking up contingent of a reward and a behavior, or a punishment and a behavior, relates to what's called habit strength. In other words, how long will a behavior exist? How do we train an organism to learn a new behavior, and how long does it last? Well, there are just a couple of things that we know, and I'm not going to ask anybody here to be responsible for knowing all this and applying it, but it's still good to know. The quickest way to teach an organism, and by organism I mean the rats that I had in a Skinner box, or your kids, or me, is to reward them every time there's a desired behavior. That is the quickest route to learning. Is that rocket science? I don't think so. You know, every time you do something, you get a reward, you're more likely to pick that up and learn it. Now, I spent 2 years studying all this behavioral stuff, and not only did I learn about decorticate cockroaches, some of you will have bad dreams tonight, and it's all my fault. Send me a bill. No, actually send it to Tracy. One of the bits of trivia that I learned, this is based on human research. I will ask if anybody's brave enough to hazard a guess. If you follow a behavior with a reward, you're increasing the likelihood that it's going to recur. Does anybody want to guess what has been found to be the most powerful contingency? At what point do you give the reward to make the greatest learning? Anybody want to hazard a guess?
Immediately after the desired.
The last time I asked this question, I got the same answer. And being the New Jerseyan I am, I said, what's that in time?
Oh, like right after you get the desired effect.
Right after. What is that in time? I'm being a pill here. We got a legitimate, and the answer is essentially right for reasons that nobody knows. But if you do research, what you will find is the quickest and strongest learning occurs when the reward is administered 0.5 seconds. 0.5 seconds after the behavior. What does that mean for you? Absolutely nothing, because we can't do anything about that. We can't operate at 0.5 seconds. It takes me more than 0.5 seconds to remember my name. But what goes to our brave person's speculation of immediately is that we do want to make the reward as soon as possible. However, what we know is that you can't run around giving people M&Ms 0.5 seconds after a desired behavior. In fact, you don't want to, because you want to stretch out the time. I remember when my kids were little, they'd get paid for doing yard work, and they'd run around and they'd pick up a few pine cones and come up and hold out their hand. I told them I'd pay them to help. So human behavior looks to immediacy of reward because it's driven, it's drive theory again. I'm hungry, I don't want to wait. Your agency, do you get paid twice a month, is it? Twice a month? You've learned to show up and engage in your behavior for 2 weeks without getting rewarded. Imagine that. That's what happens as we get older. We learn, it's called delay of gratification. That's kind of a psychological label, but we don't get rewarded immediately. We've learned, and people say, well, yeah, it's not, well, yeah, it's that we have learned how to delay gratification. And as we grow, studies have shown that the quickest learning occurs when a behavior gets rewarded immediately 100% of the time. The problem with that kind of learning is it also disappears very quickly. If payday came and you didn't get your checks, I'm sure you'd get some word, some explanation, but then 2 weeks later came and you didn't get your checks. How many people would continue, I'm not asking for a show of hands, but just questioning, how many people would continue doing that, showing up for work and doing it if you weren't getting paid? Your work is important to you, it's meaningful. I like to think mine is, but the fact is, if I stop getting an agreed upon reinforcer, the behavior stops. And programming that's written out for you often looks at extending the time between reinforcers. I don't know whether any of you have been here long enough to see programs modified, but you have to do this behavior 3 times before reward, then 5 times, and then in order to build endurance. That is shown to occur over time. It's not magic. It's the way humans learn. In fact, it's sort of a principle, if you will. It's called the partial reinforcement effect. That's a nice scientific sounding term. But they find that learned behaviors are stronger, and stronger means resistant to extinction, meaning stopping. Behaviors continue longer on their own as the reinforcement gets dragged out. And I could bore you to tears with the rat research that I did looking at reinforcement effects. You take a naive rat, naive meaning it's never been used in a study, and you put it in a Skinner box. I'm sure most people have heard of B.F. Skinner, the psychologist. Skinner boxes where rats are pretty bright, and if they push a bar down and a little cup comes up with food, it doesn't take them many trials to learn that. And if you make them hungry enough, they'll stand there and they will just mash that bar as fast as you can. It's hard to watch. And you stretch out how many bar presses needed before the dipper comes up with the food. We often use sugar water. Well, if you're a hungry rat, a little bit of sugar water, that tastes pretty good. And you start stretching out how many times they have to push the bar before it comes up with the sugar water. And yeah, it's mean. I mean, I like rats. They're fun critters. I didn't feel good about doing it, but I was getting rewarded. As a graduate student, that's how I earned my money. If I wanted to eat, I had to do this to the rats. So I had to do it, and the rats had a bar press if they wanted to earn their sugar water. And it's remarkable. And there's studies. If I reward a rat with a dipper full of sugar water for every time he pushes the bar, he'll do it 4, 5, 10 times, and he'll stop, and he'll go back later, and he'll try it again. But the behavior stops, and yet I can get a rat bar pressing hundreds, literally over 100 times a minute, it's hard to count, by changing the reinforcement contingencies. This is what we know about behavior and learning. I'm going to try to conserve time, so I'm going to skip some stuff. I don't remember whether it's on the outline, but something that is relevant, though, goes back to the idea of what is a reward. And I already told you that for me, certain things that taste good, that's rewarding. Certain kinds of music I like, that's rewarding. Certain kinds of movies are rewarding. I have a relative, a cousin actually, lives outside of New York City, loves theater. It blows my mind. She and her husband will drive across the bridge. I think it's like $12 to cross the bridge to New York one way. And they go and they pay about $50 to park their car, so they can then take a cab to the inner city and pay another $20 or $25. And these people appear to have money that I don't have, because $250, $300 a seat. There's two of them. And then after the show, they walk across the street. There's a little cafe with outside seats. It's pretty European. And for $12 or $15, you get a little cup of coffee, no refills. And another $15, you get a little pastry. And then you first have to take a cab back to where you parked the car, and then you first have to drive back. And that night, to go see a musical, which makes me want to spit up, but they love it. That's what she's into. $1,500. And she invited me to come stay with them so she could take me to New York to see these musicals. And I said, and I thought you liked me. And at first she didn't understand, and finally I said to her, I appreciate a very generous offer. Reading minds here, I assumed that they were going to spring for it. They were going to treat. I still don't want to go. I don't want to sit in a theater all dressed up to watch some people running around singing. Sorry, that's another thing you know about me that's not reinforcing. We have certain wired-in rewards, like M&Ms, that's taste. We also have what are called conditioned reinforcers. These are learned. Can anybody think of what might be a conditioned reinforcer? Did somebody say something? I'm hearing things. Okay. Well, Tracy reminded me to take my medication when we leave. Take a 6-month-old or 8-month-old child in a crib and wave a shiny piece of green tinfoil over them in a $50 bill. What are they going to reach for? They're going to go for the tinfoil because it's shiny, it's attractive. The value of the $50 bill is learned. It has no reinforcing value to a child, an infant. Certain things have learned, acquired value. And when we program, we look to find primary reinforcers, the M&Ms, and some of you, conditioned reinforcers. Anybody here work with anybody who's on a program where people earn a star? Any star programs? Of course. I know because I'm looking at some of the data. Stars are not inherently reinforcing, but if, just like cash money, if that piece of paper translates into a primary reinforcer, it's good to go. That's when I get a check in the mail, that's a conditioned reinforcer. I'm sure my pupils get big, I breathe a sigh of relief. Oh, I can pay my bills again. That's rewarding. So when we look at behavioral programs, we gotta know what is reinforcing to a person. And I always tell an embarrassing story, embarrassing on myself. I made such a remarkable goof, and some of you heard this. I know Matt's heard me tell he's nodding, so he could probably tell you for me. But I'm in my nice behavior modification unit, and we get a new individual. And we're reviewing the history and talking about what they need to learn, and I'm there with all my staff. And the person has a weakness, if I remember, it was something like hand washing. Well, this was a behavior modification unit. We have structured, standardized training programs for everything under the sun, and they're uniform. All staff do it the same way. And so I said, okay, our new guy needs to learn to wash his hands better. So break out your behavior program for hand washing, get your M&Ms, and have at it. And of course, my staff, because all they do is behavior programming, they're collecting data. Ooh, people hate that. You know, when I say, I gotta have base rate data, but we want you to do a program. We want you to change their behavior. If I don't have base rate data, we don't know whether it's changed. How do you know? If you don't know where it starts, how do you know when it's different? So my staff are collecting data, and a week later, baseline, no change. I say, okay, no big deal. We'll review it next week. Next week I show up. Baseline, no change in hand washing behavior. Huh, okay, well, who knows? We'll do it again. And next week, no change in the behavior. And I'm standing in front, just like this. They were spread around an open unit. And I'm thinking out loud to myself, well, we know what the target behavior is. You people know the program. You know how to run it. I'm not really expecting this, but behavior being behavior, you know, sometimes you never know. And from the back of the room, there's a little voice that said, Dr. Gulkin, he doesn't like M&Ms. And I did an immediate flash. I went back because I'm the director. I said, start the program and give him his M&Ms. Well, they took me literally, and I didn't say this out loud. I think it was a little passive aggressive that they kept dragging out and didn't tell me that sooner. And I froze and I said, you're telling me we were reinforcing him with something he didn't like? Yeah. I said, that's not good. I said, does anybody here know anything that he likes? And someone said, he really likes sugar pops. Now, that is one of the 3 nastiest cereals ever made. And I said, oh, okay. And I said, we're going to take a break, about 10 minutes. I'll be right back. Went outside and got, early 1970s. I'm a graduate student, so of course I'm driving a VW Beetle, and I hop in my Beetle and I buzz to the nearest grocery and I buy a box of sugar pops. And we go back, we go into the bathroom, and I say, okay, I don't care who's going to do it, but here are the sugar pops. Prime the pump. The behavioral concept of you give a person a taste of the reward. That motivates them. That's part of the drive. And let's see what happens. So they sat him down, gave him a couple of sugar pops, and they took some out, and they said to him, okay, whatever his name is, wash your hands. He washed his hands like a surgeon. He had the behavior down pat, but he didn't like M&Ms. He had no reason. Did you need to come in?
Yeah.
Okay. He had no reason to do the behavior. We weren't reinforcing him. Now, I was thinking this young gentleman probably needs about 20 years of psychotherapy to understand why he doesn't like M&Ms. That's hard for me to understand. That being said, I didn't bother with the psychotherapy. I said, we're going to do sugar pops. Now, it's an example of how a seemingly subtle mistake has big effects. I screwed up the program inadvertently. My personal stuff slipped out. Who doesn't like M&Ms? Really? That's hard for me to wrap my brain around. But I found, in fact, there is at least one person in the world who doesn't like M&Ms. So, sugar pops is not a conditioned reinforcer. That's a pure positive. You know, I don't think you learn to like sugar pops. It either tastes good or it doesn't. And I said it before, I'm going to say it again, tacked on the end of that. When we're talking about programming and learning, please remember one of the most powerful reinforcers is attention. Attention is free. Unlike M&Ms, you never get too full. It tends to be an ongoing reinforcer. And you don't need a written program by me to give people positive attention. You know, some of the really, really good staff that I see, the behavior programmers, when I watch them walking around, they are always smiling and giving people attention, patting them on the back, complimenting them. Oh, you're really doing a good job there. Is that a written program? No, but they're rewarding someone for doing something appropriate. We can impact so much behavior at no cost. Tracy doesn't have to pay for my time for that kind of programming. And you can't do it too much. Please remember your powerful, powerful forces in changing behavior. Okay. Under the section that I have that I call details of learning, I've said this, but I gotta say it again, learning is slow. I'm sorry to say, trauma learning may be fast, but most learning of human behavior under, quote, normal circumstances, trauma learning is not normal learning. But the typical person in a typical learning circumstance learns very slowly, incrementally. You don't, you know, it's like anybody who's learned a sport. You don't practice a few times and have everything perfect. You learn how to swing the bat, or you learn how to kick the ball or throw the bowling ball gradually. And anybody who's been involved in a sport knows you do really well one day and the next day you're back at ground zero. That is normal human learning, I am sorry to say. We can't control that. It is frustrating, it's inconvenient for me to learn slowly, and it's frustrating and inconvenient for you to have individuals who you're trying to help develop new behaviors, and they don't just, I see, and boom. That is the nature of human learning, and what makes it tolerable, not desirable, but tolerable, is recognizing and accepting the fact that we as behavior programmers are not charged with controlling a person or changing their behavior. Yes, we're responsible for overseeing their physical safety at times, ideally very rarely, but as long as there are no safety issues, our charge is to carry out the assigned programs as written. Whether it's one of my behavioral programs or something within the agency, you do what is expected of someone in your position, but the individual's response is beyond your control. How do you become responsible for what a person remembers, understands, or decides to go with? You can't. And it's becoming comfortable with that definition of your role that makes the sad and disappointing reality tolerable. Permanence of change. This, I don't want to spend a lot of time on that, but depending upon how a behavior program is set up, I will tell you, if somebody gets a reward every time they do something, they're more likely to stop doing it once the rewards stop. You know, and some people develop an internal sense where they decide, oh, you know, I kind of enjoy this, and they might maintain a behavior. But the fact is, the strength of the behavior is going to vary with the program and the individual. In fact, one of the spooky little things in my profession as a behaviorist, has anyone here ever noticed that something that you knew well and just totally cold, you suddenly forgot? Am I the only one who's ever forgotten how to do something? Well, behaviors like that. When you put a person in a behavioral program and they're washing their hands and they go 3 weeks, 4 weeks, and you're stretching out the time between the rewards, you know, the sugar pops are getting less and less frequent. 6 months down, when everything's been going well, the behavior stops. Huh? What does that mean? Well, you know, it's more frequently asked, why did that happen? And I say, God wanted him to stop washing his hands. That's why. Well, what happened? Well, it's called, you don't have to remember this, spontaneous disinhibition. Isn't that a wonderful term? Spontaneous disinhibition. Inhibition is a force against something, and when you're disinhibited, that means you do it. So if when I get angry I yell and you put me on a program, I learn to inhibit my yelling. Something happens and suddenly I yell again. Well, that means I've been disinhibited. The force against it stopped. And we call it spontaneous because there's nothing special that happened. Guess what? Human behavior. You ain't gonna get a journal article out of saying, gee, we taught this person to wash their hands, and 6 months later, they wouldn't do it. Wow, imagine that. Not magic, not spooky. You know, you might have to review whether or not, you know, some more programming is called for. And again, we talked about all the different variables. What if they had a headache or a stomach ache? What if their hands were chapped? There are a lot of physical things that could be involved. You can't always get an answer, but when you're working with someone and they're in the process of developing a new behavior, either learning a new behavior or a decreasing one, they're going to slip back. That's the nature of human learning. And I'm going to make what sounds like a negative comment, but it goes to the reality of what we're doing and how we're doing it. I label it as the weakness of behavioral programs. I don't remember whether that made it on. Oh yeah, there it is. It's the very bottom of the sheet. And don't get too excited because this is the end of the sheet, but I have another page of notes after this. So the weakness of behavioral programs is that they don't change and control the behavior that you want to modify. Pure and simple. I take all the time to write a program and their behavior doesn't change. Imagine that. But that's the nature of the process. It is gradual. It is the effect of a lot of variables, the rewards, the punishment, the drive. Again, if somebody's not hungry, they're not going to perform a lot for M&Ms. We don't control behavior. Legal, moral, ethical things keep us from doing that. Talking with some staff, I don't even remember but an individual would get up and leave their room. And they asked, well, what can they do to stop that behavior at night? And I said, handcuff them to the bed. And they looked at me and I said, but I never said that, because that would be unethical. It is not morally appropriate. It would work. I've already talked with you about lead injections, but those interventions are not legal or ethical. So we do what we can. And one of the things I haven't mentioned to this point, and I'm hoping at least some of you are familiar with the Premack principle. Premack was a behavioral psychologist, and he identified something that was named after him. I don't know whether he named it after himself, but it speaks to the question, how do I know what is rewarding for a given person? Because when I talk with staff about setting up a program, one of the things I always do, I say, okay, we identify the target behavior, and yep, I'm sorry, I put you through the hard work, the unpleasant work of getting base rate data. That is, how often is the person doing this? If you cannot tell me that, we won't know whether the program is working. So you've gotten the base rate data, you know how often something is happening, and now we want to develop a pure positive program. What are we going to reinforce them with? Well, as is often the case, we don't have good control. Until Stacy gives me that $20,000 in quarters, I can't set up a program distributing them. So one of the solutions is you need to start putting pressure on Stacy. People have dietary restrictions, so we can't give them all M&Ms. It would seem to be simple with me because I'm rather skinny, but I'm also diabetic. So while my body weight would tolerate M&Ms to no end, my blood sugar wouldn't, so that doesn't help. And Premack comes up with what's as good a tool as any. The Premack principle says if you watch a person, anything that they select is reinforcing. Self-selected behaviors, by definition, are what the person wants to do. So you can identify reinforcers by doing that. Had you been watching me for the last 40 years, you would never see me going to New York to a musical. So Premack says that's probably not a reinforcing state of affairs for me, and it isn't. But as you work with people, are they given television shows? Are they given talking books? Music they like, going for a walk, playing a board game, tic-tac-toe, anything you observe as a self-selected behavior is reinforcing, which means it can become a part of a reinforcement menu. And some people are different, where you can have just one or two reinforcers that are always good. Others will be a challenge. And that is why we don't control, because what is reinforcing to a person may not be obvious to us, or may be obvious, but we can't use as a reinforcer. And yes, that means behavioral programming is limited and is difficult, but that's a reality, and I don't know an alternative. No. So, my good friend Premack. Okay. I have a page that I'm going to just kind of buzz through, and after I did my handout, I decided, oh, there's more stuff I probably ought to say. So I have a little sheet of afterthoughts. What do we do is difficult and is frustrating. You know, the gradual nature of it. That's the bad news. What is working in our favor is, in fact, we have control, limited, but we have control over certain aspects of a person's environment. In fact, we control reinforcement. In fact, there are certain punishing things like neutral area, which used sparingly but is still there, over which we have some control. And as long as we understand that our measured use of reinforcement and punishment impacts a person's behavior gradually over time, then we can go to bed at night and say, I did that which can be done and that which is reasonable. There are a lot of other things that could be done which we can't do, and that is the bottom line. And it comes back to the idea, as a behavior modifier, I don't change people. And my mood doesn't change people. And just because I'm disappointed in you or I'm angry at you, that doesn't change people's behavior. What is going to change a person's behavior is the outcome of that behavior. If the behavior produces a reinforcing state of affairs, that behavior is going to gradually change. It will. And if the behavior produces a punishing state of affairs, that behavior will gradually change. And again, we're not talking crisis behavior here. You know, if somebody is going to run into the street as staff, you have to make an effort to control them. And I go back to the beginning. My timing is I came into state at the time of the big turnover with the change in the law, the Grafton lawsuit. Does anybody old enough here to remember the Grafton lawsuit? Well, I remember it well because I came in the beginning of July of '76, and it wasn't but a couple months later when the lawsuit is settled, and I'm at the North Dakota State Hospital, and they're saying, we're emptying out Grafton, we're putting them in the community, and yeah, we're probably going to have to take 25% of the state hospital budget to fund that. Well, I turned cold because the psychology department had 8, and a quarter of 8 is 2. That meant the psychology department is going to lose 2 people, and I was the newbie. You know, I was there a couple of months, and I said, oh my, let me guess if I can figure out who the other person is who's going. Well, happily, that was just political spooky talk. They didn't do that. but I remember it crystal clear because I thought I was going to sink into my shoes. But that was the change, and the idea was that the Grafton facility was too restrictive, and they wanted to be less restrictive, and they wanted to provide more normalized environment for developmentally disabled individuals. And they didn't have a good idea of exactly what they were going to do yet. But they did know there were going to have to be some changes made out in the community, and happily DD found its way to setting up a lot of community programs around the state, of which Open Doors one, and with a heavy behavioral orientation. There's no other practical way to do it. And selection has to do with whether or not an individual can reasonably be maintained in a community setting and handled with the interventions that can be used in the community. And there are programs that cannot be run in the community, and those individuals have to be considered for other placement. And some of you have been here long enough to have gone through that, and I've been through that a number of times, where the agency has a very painful process of reviewing whether or not an individual can be served here. And we want to do what we can, but what we can do has certain limits, and not everybody can make it here. But those who can are managed in a respectful way, hopefully mostly behavioral. And going back to your individual responses, given your job, the target behaviors that we look to change, especially ones that we want to reduce in frequency, because we're not talking about things that are very harmful or destructive. Those are different things to talk about. Most of them are just, awkward, uncomfortable, mildly disruptive. We have to tolerate them with a smile, because if we own responsibility and we start getting into control, we develop a failure situation. Power struggles, I always, as a psychologist, I always say, no one ever wins a power struggle. Power struggles are not won, they just escalate. And we address the target behavior programmatically, meaning you look inside your mind and you say, oh yeah, the program says when this happens, this is what we do. And you try to do that neutrally if it's a negative target behavior. Ideally, if someone did a positive thing that you're trying to increase, that's when you not only give them the star, but you smile, you pat them on the back, you encourage them, give them lots of verbal praise. Because deep in your heart, having listened to me, what you've come to understand is that what affects a given individual and their behavior is the outcome of their behavior. It's not what you say. The outcome of their behavior is what over time will result in a change in that behavior. And people who are doers often get caught up in a bind because they want to more actively control, and I gotta assure you, that's a losing path. I have a bunch more things that I want to say, but at this point, I think I've overwhelmed you with an outrageous amount of information, so I'm gonna reinforce all of you by stopping. So that's a form of withholding a punisher. So I'm rewarding you by not doing that anymore. And what I want to do then is just say, I'm going to be here for a while. If any of you have questions, I'll take them. And Tracy, I don't know what you want to do. Well, as far as I'm concerned, people have heard what I wanted to say. If people have places to go and things to do and you would like to get up and leave, I'm comfortable with that. Anybody who wants to hang out to ask questions or discuss some things, I'm just going to be here. Thank you all. You're a very attentive group, and I do appreciate that. I hope the material hangs together. I didn't teach you how to develop behavioral programs, but all this material speaks to what you as staff do as you make an effort to translate those words on the paper into the living experience for the individual. Be well all. Okay. And see, the behaviorist's question is, are they applauding to reward me because I shut up? Or is the reward supposed to be for what I did? I will tell you that I used that as a demonstration. I was teaching introductory psychology at the University of Jamestown, and we got to the little module on behavioral psychology, and it happened to be a big group, but a very active one, interactive and everything. And so they're asking me all these questions about human learning and behavior theory, and then they don't understand. And one of the students said to me, "Can you give us a demonstration?" I said, "Huh?" And he said, "Well, you know, you're talking to us about those behaviors. Can you give us some sort of demonstration of how this stuff actually works?" I stopped. I said, "Well, I suppose." And I said, "Well, I've got to think about it." And someone said, "Well, why don't you just do it now?" And I said, "Well, don't put me under pressure or anything." But I thought for a minute. I said, okay, I'm going to give you a demonstration of non-cognitive, non-thinking based learning. And I said, but to do that, I need an experimental subject, and I did not bring any of my rats with me, so I need a volunteer. And one of the young guys who was pushing me to do this raised his hand. I said, "Go out in the hall, and we'll come and get you." And he said, "What should I do?" I said, "Stand out in the hall away from the door, and someone will bring you back in." And he said, "But what am I supposed to do when I come in?" I said, "Come in, that's all." I mean, this is the equivalent of a decorticate cockroach. It was a freshman, so the difference between a decorticate cockroach and the freshman, not too big. So I said to the class, okay, we want to modify his behavior. We want to show a change in behavior. Anybody have any thoughts? And yeah, there are a few thoughts, but nothing too practical. And I just looked around and I said, okay, here's a behavior that is not normally emitted, zero frequency. I said, when he walks in the door, what is the likelihood that he's going to walk up to the front of the class, and behind me there is a slide projector screen up there. I said, how likely is it that he walks in here and pulls the screen down? And everybody agreed that that's not a typical behavior. You don't expect that. We didn't do a long baseline study, but it's not common. And I said, okay, we want to shape that behavior. And I didn't cover that in my notes. Behavioral shaping is where when you want a certain behavior, you reward someone as they start getting closer and closer to it, as the behavior starts to appear. And I said, okay, so if we want him to pull that down, that means when he comes through the door, we somehow need to, without telling him, See, we're not going to just say, go pull down the screen. We need him to walk around, go down, come behind me, reach up and pull down the screen. That's the target behavior, very complex. And I said, question is, how do we reward behavior that we're going to shape? And you know, people throw out some things. Yeah, if I had enough quarters to throw at him, I could shape it that way. I said, the only thing that really comes to mind is in our culture, there's a form of attention that's rewarding. You've already done that. You thanked me. Applause. So I said, here's the deal. Nobody says nothing to him when he walks through the door, walks through. As soon as he does anything that approaches that, we're going to clap. And if he turns away, we're going to stop. And so he walked in, and he looked around, and he turned a little bit. We started applauding. And he was a joker because he jumped, his eyes got big, and he ran out. And I said, no, bring him back in. Brought him back in, and I can't tell you, because I didn't time it, it took 4 or 5 minutes, maybe 6 minutes. But simply applauding, he recognized that we applauded when he moved, and there are times he would change direction and the applause would stop, and you know, we shaped his behavior. Nobody said nothing to him. We got him to walk around. He came up and he's rummaging on my, he's going through my briefcase. He's a joker, of course. And he's looking under my jacket. But he doesn't get applause for that. And he finally turns around and the applause just broke out. And he's reaching and of course he reached up to look and a lot of applause. And he pulled it down and I think they heard the applause and screaming in the next building. How did he know? Well, he didn't, quote, know. You know, the applause was, and because he was a joker, I think the applause really was rewarding for him. He enjoyed that. He enjoyed that. No cognition, you know. He asked me, what do I do? I say, just come back. That's the only thing he knew. And is it telling? I think it goes to the very nature of how our behavior is influenced by our experiences. You got to have a, quote, need, and it's drive theory. You know, M&Ms won't drive behavior of non-hungry people. But we live in a world where the individuals you work with have enough drives that it is reasonable to set up programs that provide them with reinforcement of their individual needs. And again, the challenge, the biggest challenge, is finding effective reinforcers. We're limited, but having acknowledged the limit, it is also one of the most powerful things available to us. And we can change behavior. Not totally. You know, doesn't matter how much we reward someone, we can't get them to fly by flapping their arms. It's not biologically possible. But it is possible to get them walking around a large auditorium and pulling down a screen without any prior knowledge of that. But that's just, yes?
In your experience, when you're writing the plans, what kind of things make it easier for staff to be consistent? You know, like if you've got a staff of 10 people or 15 people trying to implement the plans, what have you learned in writing these as far as what makes it, the consistency better?
That's a really good question. When I write a plan, I don't sit in my office in Jamestown. I tend to be here and I'm with at least one person a lot of times several, and I try to get a sense of the environment that might impact some of the variables, try to get a sense of what is doable, because programs that are set up for one program may not be workable for another. I try to get as much information from staff as I can. Make an effort to find what might work. What do we know about the individual? Some programs allow for staff to have a lot of flexibility in doing things. When someone has a one-to-one, programming can look very different than when they're in line of sight, but they don't have one-to-one. So I try to get information. I can't change the world. There are external variables that I don't control. But when I write a program, the one thing that you can know is that everything that I write, that I request, is going to be kind of outlined here in is it a reward? Is it a punishment? Do we define the target behavior? One of my big frustrating one of my behaviors that frustrates staff is they want a program, and I say, what do we have for baseline data? That's the first killer question. Do we have baseline data? A lot of times you do, because people will say, well, we keep these sheets, and they can tell me that over the last so many weeks the target behavior has occurred. Another personal story, when I was teaching that behavior modification staff, we wanted to make a case that behavioral data requires a baseline. And to tell you how long ago this was, I was in a hospital and I was smoking. We don't do that too much anymore. I smoked a pipe. And what we did, we got a Confederate, we got one of the staff, and what they did is they tracked, pipe smokers are known for a behavioral manifestation, which is pipe lighting. Pipes don't stay lit, especially if you're talking. So, I was always lighting my pipe. And at some point, I said to the group of staff in training, I said, let's say we're going to do a program, and the program is to change my smoking behavior. I say, I want everybody to take a little piece of paper. It's anonymous, don't push anyone, but write down how frequently I light my pipe. And everybody takes it, they pass it forward, and I say, why did I do this? You're going to set up a program, and you're going to try to change that behavior, whether you want to increase it or decrease it. And how are we going to know whether your program is effective? So what I did is I started going through the slips, and on the chalkboard, I'm putting, some people put that I was lighting my pipe, I'm trying to remember, like 3 times a minute, and others thought I was doing it about 3 times an hour. And I plotted it on a graph, and I said, these are your observations. You're all sitting in the same room, looking at me at the same time, and look at how different they are. If you put me in a program, whether you're trying to increase my pipe lighting or decrease it, how are you going to interpret the results of the program with this set of data? And the answer is, you don't have the foggiest idea. Because if I start lighting my pipe 3 times an hour, some of you are going to say it hasn't changed. And if I start lighting my pipe 40 times an hour, or 5 times a minute, some of you are going to say it's slowed down. This is why we need base rate data. you have to know what you're looking at. In other words, you know, if I take my temperature right now and it's 99.2, I have a temperature because my average temperature happens to be like 97.6. So when I was coming in and signing in, you know, when the plague struck and they were taking my temp, I would look at that, and there are times my temperature would be like 98.8. And they said, oh, you're good. And I'm thinking to myself, actually, I'm a little high. Not clinically high, but for me, high. That, you know, base rate data is not a luxury if you're going to do behavioral programs. So, you know, when we define the target behavior, that's the other thing. You know, people, you know, what is the target? What are we? Well, they're loud. That's a tough one. That's a common. That's tough. You know, what's loud? How do you measure it? I really struggle with that one. We do the best we can, but other behaviors like stealing is better defined, a little easier, still hard sometimes. But we got to define a behavior, we got to get a baseline, and then we got to set up a behavioral program, and that's my job because I'll find out what's rewarding and what's punishing. And all those silly little words on the page are not there just because I think it sounds good or because I think it's a neat thing to do. It's because it falls in line with all of the principles, all of the materials that we know affect behavior. Does that give you control? Absolutely not. You want to facilitate change, and that's what you implement a program to do, but you're not responsible for controlling that.
Thank you.
Now, I promised Tracy I would be done by 3:30, and it looks like it's 3:28, which means to keep my promise, I can only talk for another 2 minutes, but I don't have to. Well, again, thank you all, and appreciate the questions as they've come in. I will be around for a couple of months, and you know, you may direct questions to me, and good luck with the very hard and very important work you're doing.